worked in Zimbabwe, Uganda, Nigeria, and South Africa on the same process. After that, I came to the Caribbean, and I worked in Barbados on the master plan of Barbados, then Trinidad and Tobago, and then came to the Dutch Caribbean to work on the 5 islands of the former Netherlands and Antilles. During that experience, I learned about ILO, and I learned about the importance of social dialogue. I'll talk about that this afternoon when we talk about experiences in other countries. I was trained in Geneva in the principles of ILO, especially in social dialogue and tripartism. So this morning, the goal is to talk about the ILO principles. How many of you know what ILO stands for? Okay, so maybe in the handout we can talk a little bit about that. So ILO, why does it exist? Okay, what's the reason for it to exist? What is the ILO model of social dialogue and tripartism? And what are Convention 144 and Recommendations 152? In the last couple of years here in Curacao, the importance of these conventions becomes even more obvious to us. In the need for urgency and dialogue, also the need to understand what these conventions stand for is very important because they are necessary in order to have good social dialogue. So ILO stands for the International Labor Organization. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, at the home office of the United Nations. Okay? It is one of the many committees or organizations that are under the umbrella of the United Nations, and it has the distinct construction of being the only tripartite organization within the United Nations. How many of you have been to the ILO convention in Geneva? Okay, there are 3 persons here. Under the construction of the Netherlands and Antilles, every year the Netherlands and Antilles sent, as a representative of a part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, a delegation from the Netherlands and Antilles. That delegation was always made up of 1 person from the central unions, 1 person from the commercial sector, and 1 person from the government, usually the commissioner or the minister of labor. Okay? So that delegation went to Geneva and they sat as a part of this tripartite organization. There are over 120 countries in the world who belong to the ILO. It was actually created before the United Nations was created. So it existed before the United Nations was enacted in 1949, but the concept of trying to help people develop their countries was already in place. And then in 1996, the conventions were strengthened, and at that time there then became a national plan of development for each country. How many of you have ever heard of decent work or decent work standards? Those decent work standards are the focus of the ILO in 1996, and social dialogue and tripartism actually was born out of that. So, what are social dialogue and what is tripartism? If you wouldn't mind to take out the PowerPoint presentation, I would like you to maybe underline a couple of words in the PowerPoint, if you wouldn't mind to take that out. ILO focuses on several conventions, okay? And the social dialogue and tripartite conventions are not the only work of the ILO. Their main focus is to try to improve the understandings of not only workers, but also employers in terms of talking to each other, but also labor inspection, also in the prevention and resolution of disputes, and very importantly, the social development of the country, as well as the economic development of the country. So why is this so important? Social dialogue, which is defined now in the conventions of ILO, says that social dialogue is all types of negotiation. Okay, not just some types, but all types of negotiations, consultations, or simple exchanges of information. So if you just want to share information, like how many people are currently unemployed in a specific sector, okay? That sharing of information to, let's say, the labor unions and to the commercial sector by the government is a form of social dialogue. So the exchange between, among representatives of the government, the employers, and the workers on issues of common interest, okay? So it has to be something that you want to work on together, and it must be specifically related to the economic and the social policy, okay? So anything that comes up in a country that deals with economic policy or social policy should have conversation among the three parties. That is what the ILO is saying. If you want to move from an underdeveloped country to a developed country, you must have social dialogue about these issues. And just as Chica said in his presentation, no government can implement a policy that deals with the economy or that deals with social rights of the citizen and have it be successful without your approval. It's impossible. If Commerce says they can't implement it, if the workers say they can't implement it, then the policy will fail. Because it must be agreed upon by all parties, and it must occur through social dialogue. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. The other piece of the ILO Convention deals directly with what is tripartism. What does it mean exactly? So in the exact words of the ILO Convention, it says that tripartism is all dealings between government and workers and employer organizations concerning the formulation and implementation of economic and social policy. So, in its best construction, a country identifies together what are the policies they want to have, let's say, specifically about global competitive skills of its workers, okay? So, it talks about that, and then it says, oh, one of the things that we might want to entertain is a policy on global languages, since my friend was talking about English, okay? For example, in China, they decided that if they were going to be globally competitive, that everyone in China needed to not only speak formal Mandarin, but they should also engage in the learning of English, and in sectors where they were going to communicate with South America, like in the need for bauxite from Venezuela and grain from Brazil, that they would also have people learn Spanish. Okay? You're familiar with this because your country has had this philosophy for quite some time of quadrilingualism. Okay? So, China engaged in this. Today, there are more persons in China who speak English than all of the people in Canada, the United States, and Mexico combined. Okay? There are more people in China who speak Spanish than all of Central America, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil put together. So, when a country decides to have social dialogue and decides to work in a tripartite way, and yes, you say yes, but China's communistic, okay? It has nothing to do with communism. It has to do with having an agreement on the formulation and implementation of economic policy. If you want to have globally competitive workers, you will have policies that are agreed upon. Let's say that a global language is learned. It is not only taught in the schools, but it is encouraged in the workplace, and it is encouraged in the social life of the people. I will give you another example of this. When I worked in Singapore, there were 157 languages spoken when I first went there. There were schools taught in each of those languages. And Singapore had decided that it wanted to step onto the world stage. It wanted to be globally competitive. So they brought the unions together, they brought the commercial sector together, and they brought the government representatives together, they brought the NGOs together, the community at large, and they said, what shall we do to, as quickly as possible, become globally competitive? So they made a bold protocol which said that they would develop a policy whereby, by a certain year, this was in the 80s, so by the year 2000, that everyone in Singapore would speak English, that English would be the language of business, and that they would dedicate funding to all of the schools to transform them so that all schools would teach English as instruction. So the policy was made, and then they said, how shall we fund this? Because behind every good policy, you have to have a funding plan. So Singapore also wanted to be the #1 port in the world. So they said their goal was every piece of container, every container in Southeast Asia needed to pass somehow through the port in Singapore. They estimated the amount of growth that was going to cause, and they put the equivalent is 6 Singapore dollars, but the equivalent of $1 US tax on every container that passed through the port. It didn't touch the people at all. It touched the people coming through the port. With that money, they raised over $147 million a year to reconstruct their education system. Within 8 years, they had converted all the schools, and the children were speaking English, and the businesses were all training their employees in the global language. Okay? They actually reached that goal for economic policy 3 years before the target that they had set for themselves. How did they do that? They did it through social dialogue, and they did it through tripartism, because it meant that every employer had to agree that so many hours a day his or her employees would be engaged in English instruction. Every school was engaged in English instruction. All news programs converted to English instruction, or English broadcast, so that over time it became an English-only society. They were the only country in Southeast Asia at that time who spoke English. So when they wanted to work in the international financial sector, when they wanted to work in the tourism sector and increase tourism, whatever it was, they were positioned because they recognized that one of the most powerful tools was the ability to speak a global language. Okay? So, this is an example of the social dialogue. So, talking, exchanging information across, related to economic and social policy, and tripartism is all dealings concerning the formation or the formulation and implementation of economic development and social programming. So, the ILO model has some key points. The ILO model of social dialogue and tripartism exists to promote consensus building. It exists to promote democratic involvement among the main stakeholders in the world of work. It is all about democracy. It is about equality. Equality of say in a process. It promotes dialogue that is both formal and informal. It can be just the exchange of ideas. Hey, let's get together and let's talk about a concept, okay? I can give you another example from my personal experience.